I have a question for you. What's 2 plus 2? If you said 4, you're a mathematician. If you said, what do you want it to equal? You must be an accountant. But if you said 2 plus 2 equals 3.5, you're a quilter. Confused? Yeah, so was I at first. But I'll explain. Welcome to the world of quilting, where geometry and math meets art and functionality, where measurements are sometimes done in a something-ish, and if it doesn't fit, you either stretch the heck out of it or cut it down. It's not an exact science, but close enough and ish, if you will. Hello, my name is Eric, your treasure heart creator. If this is your first time, well, welcome. And if you are returning, well, welcome back. And perhaps you are one of the many that asked for this series. You see, in 2024 and in part of 2025-ish, I did a series of YouTube live sessions sewing together the Farmer's Wife quilt. Now, I didn't have a pattern for this quilt. All I had was a book that didn't give detailed instructions on how to sew the blocks together. It just had pictures of each block and a ton of templates that you were supposed to download and print out and cut over 100 template pieces. Yeah, I wasn't about to do that. No. What I did instead was use my knowledge about different quilting techniques and the math behind those techniques so that I could cut the fabric pieces to specific sizes, rather than using those templates and cutting individual pieces out. Now, during that whole series, I would often get the question of how I figured out what size fabric pieces I needed and what techniques to use to construct the various blocks. Now, part of that is experience, but it was mostly knowing the mathematical formulas behind all of it. And that got me thinking, there isn't a ton of video tutorials out there that teach this. So maybe I should devote a whole series of videos teaching it. But then I thought that would be totally boring to watch because who wants to do math, right? And let's be honest, doing math is not everybody's cup of tea. Still, most quilters don't realize that they're doing geometry and a little bit of Tetris trying to fit all the pieces together. And think about this. Haven't you had a time when you wanted to make a big 12-inch block, but the pattern or the instructions only created a 6-inch block, and you didn't know how to make it bigger? So after much deliberation and going over the pros and cons, I said, let's do this, and started planning out this video series. Now, over the next few videos, we will be going back to the basics. I will explain some of the techniques and the math formulas that I used when I designed my own quilt blocks, or when trying to resize a quilt block from a pattern. Each video will focus on a certain shape, concept, or technique. I'll try my best to explain the math behind it and why it is what it is. But sometimes you just have to accept what it is as for what it is because that's what it is-ish. Exactly. But before we start everything, well, I have to lay a foundation because sometimes the things we say in quilting can be confusing, just like the last statement. So let's start by clearing up some definitions that people throw around and that sometimes can mean different things. So I have a very tricky question for you, and it's about the definition of what constitutes a quilt block. Take a look at this. Is this the quilt block? Is this the quilt block? Or is this the quilt block? Well, it's kind of a tricky question because we use the term quilt block kind of interchangeably to refer to different things. For example, this might be a quilt block, this could be a quilt block, and this would be also a quilt block. The thing is, depending upon what the quilt design is, well, any one of these three could be a quilt block. What do I mean? Well, if you've ever seen a postage stamp quilt, you'll know that it's made up of tiny little squares, usually about 1 inch to 1.5 inches. you could consider this square the quilt block itself. But sometimes you make a 4-patch quilt where it's just nothing but 4 patches, in which then this would be considered the quilt block. Or sometimes you're doing something a little bit more complex where you're combining different units together to make a quilt block that's similar to this. Now, for most of you, you probably already recognize that you used a square like this and another background square to make this 4-patch unit. And you can combine different 4-patch units to make this quilt unit or this quilt block. What I really wanted to define is my use of the term quilt block, because it can get confusing to kind of distinguish what I mean by that. If I say quilt block, well, I could mean this, I could mean this, or I could mean this. Again, it just kind of depends on what the quilt top design is. Let me tell you this story. When I first started quilting, I actually took a class with an instructor, and it was a little confusing because everything she called a quilt block. And so her basic instructions, I mean, kind of stripping it down and paraphrasing what she said, you're going to, first of all, make this quilt block to construct this quilt block, and then you're going to make the final quilt block. And then for those of us that didn't know any better, well, the question became, well, what the heck is the quilt block? Instead of calling it different things, she called it all quilt blocks. What she really should have done was just give it, okay, we're going to cut this fabric piece to make this unit to make the final quilt block. That would have made a lot more sense. But because she called everything a quilt block, and technically that's not wrong, well, as a beginning quilter, it became very, very confusing as to what the quilt block really is. So I'm making this distinguishment between what a fabric piece is, what a quilting unit is, and what the actual quilt block is, just to make it clear so that when we start going through these instructions, or when I start going through all these lessons, well, you'll understand a little better what I'm actually referring to, instead of just calling everything a quilt block. So in order to avoid that confusion of what is a quilt block and what is just part of the construction of the quilt block, here's the terms I'm going to use. Anytime you cut a strip, if you're using yardage, maybe you're just using your fabric scraps, when you cut it into that strip and then you subcut it into a square and you come out with something like this, I'm going to call that a fabric piece or piece of fabric. Now, when you sew multiple pieces of fabrics together, I'm going to call that a unit. Now, you can sew multiple units together, and when you sew those multiple units together, you come out with something like this. This I'm going to refer to as the quilt block. Now, once you create the quilt block, well, then you're going to sew it to other quilt blocks to start constructing your rows and start constructing your quilt top. So again, fabric piece, unit, sewn to other units will create your quilt block. Okay? Now, how will I use these 3 terms? I might tell you what fabric piece I cut originally, and when I sewed this to another fabric piece, I'll give you what the unit size might be. Then, of course, we'll show you all the other units that you need to sew together or you need to cut to create your final quilt block. After a while, you'll kind of get the idea of what I'm trying to refer to, but I just wanted to make sure that when I say quilt block, I mean the actual finished unit where you're going to start sewing this to other quilt blocks. I don't specifically mean these things here. So I hope that makes sense. If it doesn't, well, you'll kind of get the idea as you go through the series. Have you ever had a situation where someone gave you a set of directions on making something and you felt like you got it, but then when it came time to actually make it, you kind of went, huh? Yeah. If you don't put into practice what you learn, chances are you were going to forget about it. This is why after each video, you will have an assignment. Yes, you're going to have homework, but this is the kind of homework you're going to want to do. Plus, it's optional. I'm not going to force you to do it, but it would benefit you if you did. You see, at the end of every video, I will give you what I will call a challenge block. Should you accept the challenge, you will recreate a quilt block with the fabrics of your own choice. And should you choose to, you can make the block in a different size or use whatever technique you see fit. Now, I will not be giving you step-by-step instructions on how to construct the block. Instead, I'll give you some clues and hints about the block, such as the finished size, the sizes of the individual units, or the individual fabric pieces, or how to break down the block. From these clues, you should be able to calculate what size fabric pieces to cut, and, well, you should be able to put the block together. Now, some of these challenge blocks you may find quite easy, and some of you may find others to be very difficult. And from time to time, I may throw in a bonus tip of some sort. Or if I'm evil, I will throw you a curve to really challenge you. Ha ha ha. Now, if you know me and you followed other quilt-alongs that I've done in the past, well, you're going to know that you're going to have options with these challenge blocks. What do I mean? You see, should you choose to accept the challenge and make all the quilt blocks, by the end of the series, you will have a completed quilt top. But there are actually two versions of this quilt that I have planned. One is an Irish chain inspired quilt where the blocks finish at 6 inches, and the other is this log cabin inspired quilt top where the blocks finish at 12 inches. Or you could go totally rogue and design your own quilt. In fact, I'm going to actually encourage you to do that, to really challenge yourself. And in some videos, if you don't like the challenge block, I may give you a few alternatives. Or again, you can go totally rogue and just design your own quilt block. All this to illustrate that the choices are yours to make. Now, given that you'll have the freedom to make your own choices about the challenge block or the quilt that you make, well, I can't tell you exactly how much fabric you're going to need. In addition, some of you may find that you will want to create a practice block to check your calculations. But I didn't want to leave you totally in the dark on this topic because I get how frustrating it is to find out too late that you don't have enough fabric, especially if it's something out of print. So here's what I will say. Create practice blocks with your less desirable fabrics, aka your ugly stash. Now, sometimes even I want to double check my math because I'm not 100% sure. That is when I go through my less desirable fabrics or my ugly stash, and I'll make a practice block. This way, if there is a mistake in my calculations, I don't waste the good fabric. And let me tell you, many yards of nice fabric have been saved by simply making a practice or a test block. Use your scraps. I shopped my scrap fabric and pulled a number of fat quarters when choosing my prints or my colored fabrics. I would encourage you to do the same. Don't feel like you need to buy fabric for this specific quilt or project. Instead, I would just encourage everyone to use what you got. This is really just meant to be a teaching tool, and the fact that you got a quilt top out of it is a bonus. For my prints or my colored fabrics, I probably use the equivalent of about 20 fat quarters or about 5 yards if you're going to do one print. But don't quote me on that because I'm really kind of guesstimating at that. Plus, I made both the 6-inch and the 12-inch versions of the quilt top. Point being, you probably have a sizable scrap stash and you might be complaining that it keeps growing. So why not shrink it a little bit by using it for this challenge? Now, of course, I can't stop you from buying more fabric if you feel the need to. But if you're gonna buy fabric, buy background fabric and buy lots of it. Guesstimating again, I probably used about, say 4 yards or so. But again, don't quote me on that. Now, if you end up buying fabrics as background, I would say get at least 4 yards, if not more. I wouldn't say it's a waste since you can always use it in backing or in another quilt. So I know someone is going to ask this question, so let me just address it right now. There is no pattern for any of this. In fact, the sole purpose of this entire series is for you to learn how to do the math behind all of this and figure it out on your own. So having a pattern would only defeat the purpose of this, since you would already have the answers to the problem. But I do recognize that sometimes when you're stuck, it's helpful to know the answer or have the opportunity to ask questions. So here's what I'm going to suggest instead. Now, for the past 2 years, I have been hosting a Zoom call where subscribers can kind of come and sew and chat and share ideas and stories. If you have a question or are having problems, well, joining us on Zoom will be the perfect opportunity to get help. And you will have the benefit of having others help you with the same issues that you're having. That way, you can get different perspectives on the problem. Now, these Zoom calls are once a month and they are free to join. You just need to have a free Zoom account. Now, if you're interested in joining the Zoom, send an email to treasureheartcreations@gmail.com and I'll get you that information. And no, this is not a gimmick for you to join the Zoom. Did I mention it's free? Now, I really don't gain anything from hosting these Zoom calls. In fact, I actually lose money from it since I have to pay for the licensing, which I will gladly do because it's more important for me to watch you succeed. And if you say that you don't know how to use Zoom, well, let me make a suggestion. Clearly, you know how to use YouTube, so why not use it to find tutorials on how to use Zoom? There's a ton of videos that will teach you just that. Now, these Zoom calls are usually on a Saturday afternoon from 12 p.m. Pacific Standard Time till whenever we all get tired of chit-chatting and sewing. But I understand that not everyone can make it on Saturdays. So for a limited time, I will host an additional Zoom. This is to give more opportunity to those that can't make it on a Saturday. Now, the time and the day of these bonus Zooms is to be determined later. Now, if you've been joining the regular Saturday Zoom calls every month, I'm not kicking you out. In fact, I'm going to actually ask you to be there to help answer some of the questions and share your own knowledge. And we will still get to do our normal Zoom shenanigans. As of now, there are 6 planned videos that will talk about constructing various quilting units. The first video, we will talk about squares and strips. Now, this is the most basic of quilting units, and this is usually the first thing you learn how to sew when you start quilting. As basic as this may be, there are some important implications to learning about constructing these basic units because it lays the foundation for how to do the math and the design layouts for any quilt block and any quilt for that matter. Now, from that first video, we will start expanding into other topics, such as asking a question of what happens when you snowball a corner of a quilt block or quilt unit. What size square do you need to make a half square triangle of a certain size? Or what's the best way to make half square triangles? How do you calculate the size of a side-sitting triangle when you need to make a quilt on point? How do you calculate the size of or the size square you need to make a 4-at-a-time flying geese unit? How about half rectangle triangle? All of these topics and more will be covered throughout these next few videos. Now, this first video is scheduled to go on live on this YouTube channel early February 2026. This will give you time to gather up all of your fabrics. Fair warning, this first video will have you making challenge blocks multiple times. This is because you're building the layout of the quilt, so don't be surprised when I tell you you need to make 18 blocks, or 12 blocks, or maybe 9. After that first video, every 2 or 3 weeks or so, the next video in the series will premiere right here on the Treasure Heart Creations YouTube channel. Now don't worry, If you get busy and you have to put this on delay for some time, don't worry. The videos will still be on the YouTube channel when you're ready. But remember, the bonus Zooms will only be for a limited time, so keep that in mind. Now, after the initial 6 videos are done, or maybe should I just say in the future, I may add another video or 2 from time to time. But those will be one-off videos, and I probably won't do a whole quilt thing out of it. They'll be more or less just one-off tutorials. So, are you excited for the series? Are you gonna perhaps join in making the quilt top or do the challenge blocks? Put a comment down below. Let me know if you're gonna be actively participating in this quilt challenge or in this quilt series. Well, that's it for this intro video. Now gather up your fabrics and remember that the first video is coming out in early February 2026. And until then, let's all get out there. Let's all create some